Hey, what's up, tubers? It's Tony, and today we're going to be talking about the location of and how to replace your coolant temperature sensor on your 2004 Chevy Trailblazer, and also the location and how to remove it and replace it on your 2006 Chevy Trailblazer. On earlier model Trailblazers, I think before 2006, the coolant temperature sensor is located behind the alternator. On late model Trailblazers, like 2006 on up to 2009, as you face the motor, the coolant temperature sensor is located on the passenger side of the motor, right in the back next to the firewall. This engine is the same as the GMC Envoy, okay? They're the same exact engine, the 4.2 liter motor. So on the earlier model Envoys, before 2006, I believe the coolant temperature sensor is located behind the alternator. And just like the late model Trailblazers, as you face the motor, it's located on the passenger side of the motor. And don't worry, I'm going to show you all of this. For those of you that need to replace the alternator because it's failed or because you need to access the coolant temp sensor, I have a video out there already that will show you how to replace the alternator on a Chevy Trailblazer. Again, remember, this is the same as the GMC Envoy. Before working on anything electrical in your vehicle, guys, you want to disconnect the black cable from your battery. You also want to wait until the engine is completely cool before you start this process, and have a catch can available to catch the coolant that will come out when you remove the coolant temp sensor. Now, a lot of folks will reach out to me saying, where's the coolant temp sensor? Some guy told me it's behind the alternator. I took it apart and then there's no coolant temp sensor. So I'm going to show you how to determine where the coolant temp sensor is, okay? So this is the 2004. What you want to do is face the motor, look at the alternator, and look for this sensor right here, okay? If you come in and see that sensor there, then 9 times out of 10, that temp sensor is located behind the alternator. So always look for this sensor right here, and you can follow the wire to it. It goes down and runs in that direction. There are some people who will try and get to that coolant temp sensor without taking the alternator out. I don't go through all of that, guys. I just take the alternator out, and it gives me easy access to the coolant temperature sensor. I want you guys to also keep in mind that to break loose the coolant temperature sensor that's behind the alternator, you need an 18mm 3/8 socket, driver, and ratchet. For the coolant temp sensor that's located in this corner, whether it's an Envoy or a Trailblazer, it's a 15mm socket. So just be mindful of that, okay? So to get started, guys, after you disconnect the black cable from your battery, you're going to need to remove the drive belt. Take a 3/8 ratchet and insert it into the head of the belt tensioner. I usually take a bigger socket and a long driver, and I put over the arm of the ratchet for leverage, and then crank the driver towards the driver's side of the motor. That will take the tension off of the belt, and then you can slip the belt off. The next thing you're going to need to do is break loose these two 15mm bolts. This 10mm bolt, break that loose first, and then take something and pry this up off of its housing. And there's another 15mm bolt back there that you will access it from this direction with a long driver and a 15mm socket, and then you can remove this bracket. So take something and pluck this out. I use one of these little pry tools that will allow you access to get back to that 15mm bolt back there. So that's how you're going to approach that bolt in there, with a driver, 15mm socket, and ratchet. So now that you remove that bracket, you have two 15mm alternator bolts up top to remove, okay? And then you have one down the bottom, down there, underneath the alternator. I want you to break the one down here first. Break it loose, but don't pull it out. Then break these two loose, but don't take them all the way out. What will happen is you want to take the bottom bolt out first, because when you take the bottom, if you take the two top bolts out first, the alternator will want to hang down on that bottom bolt and put stress on it when you're trying to turn it out. So occasionally you'll have to lift the alternator up, and that's why you're going to loosen these two bolts really good up top. You have to raise the alternator up a little bit to unscrew that bottom bolt, and it's a 15mm socket. So there's the bottom bolt, and now you can raise up on the alternator a little bit and remove the two top bolts, and then lay the alternator on the side and disconnect the electrical connector and the battery cable. Remember to periodically raise up on the alternator. That will take the stress from the alternator resting on the bolts, and then you can unscrew them better. Break loose this 10mm retaining bolt. That's how I did it. Next thing you want to do is take something pointy, put it under this electrical connector, pluck it up, and then you can pull, or you can use your finger, and then you can pull the electrical connector away from the alternator. Just be careful not to break it. I usually use one of these little picks to pluck up the electrical connector, and with the other hand I pull the connector away from the alternator. To remove this bolt back there, it's a 10mm nut. Now, the challenge for you guys, and I've been doing this a long time, is you'll have to squeeze with everything disconnected. I usually just squeeze the alternator through this area. You can remove the upper fan shroud or the battery tray if you believe it'll help you get it out, but I usually just get it through there one way or another. So see folks, eventually I just turn the alternator around, take my time and squeeze it through there. You'll get it. Now, remember I told you to verify if the coolant temperature sensor is located behind the alternator. Again, do what? Look for that electrical connector. Now that I've removed the alternator, there is my coolant temperature sensor, okay? And how do you get it disconnected, guys? Take something pointy and point and push in that little white area, and at the same time you have to pull up this little white thing all the way around. It's nothing more than a lock. When you pull it up, then you can push the black tab in and separate the electrical connector from the sensor's harness. So there's the lock pushed up, and now you can just simply push that black tab and pull the electrical connector free. There it is, guys. This will stay with the car. You don't want to damage this. You'll notice that the wiring harness for the sensor's connector is mounted right here. Just take something and pry that off of its housing. The new sensor comes with its own little clip that will go into there. Again, I use one of these little pry bars from Harbor Freight. Just put it back in there, guys, and simply pry it out, and it will come out. Okay? Come on, come on. So there's the old sensor. And for those of you that want to know, how do I get it out? Well, I just go down here and I cut the wire as close to the sensor as I possibly can. Or you can use an 18mm wrench and go down in there and turn it out. It's up to you. But if you know for a fact that you're not going to be using the sensor, meaning you're going to replace the sensor, just get a pair of cutters and cut the wire as close to the sensor as you possibly can. Put an 18mm socket over that sensor, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, guys. In some cases, I just ram the wire into the sensor with the socket and turn it out that way as well. So at least you have options. Well, placing the socket over the wire and trying to remove that sensor didn't work. So, as you see, I just simply cut the wire. So that's all you need to do is just put the 18mm socket over the sensor, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. Just turn it out until it comes out, guys. And there's your old coolant temperature sensor, okay? The new one goes right back in the reverse order that you used to take the old one out. The only difference is when you're gonna hand tighten the new one as tight as you can get it by hand, and then you have to take a short driver and a crow's foot, or you can get an 18mm wrench and go up in there and tighten it. And you don't need to over tighten it, guys, but you want to make sure that it's tight. And now you know where it is and how to determine if it's behind the alternator or not. So when you go to put that back in, guys, this is a crow's foot. You want an 18mm. You can use a swivel, that's optional, and a long or short driver depending on what works for you. Just go down in there and handle your business. Another way of verifying if the sensor is on the passenger side of the motor, again, if you don't see that electrical connector there, then it's on the left side, the passenger side next to the firewall. You want to remove your air box, 10mm, 10mm, 8, and then you can pull your air box out. What you want to also do is disconnect this hose, and then there's a clamp right there that you want to disconnect. So once you remove the air box for the sensor that would be on the passenger side in the corner, here's your oil cap. I refer to this as the runway. Follow the runway all the way in the back next to the firewall, and you will find the coolant temp sensor's electrical connector mounted here. Pry it out of its housing just like I did with the other sensor, okay? And then you should see a wire running down there. That's where the coolant temp sensor is located, next to that little silver hose. Be mindful, you can push that hose forward to expose the sensor. The best way to get to the sensor, guys, is to jack up the passenger side of the front passenger side of the motor, put it on jack stands, and then you want to remove the passenger front wheel, and then I'll show you where it is from there. Okay folks, there are your ignition coils for those of you that are looking for them. There's your throttle body right there. And I want you guys to keep in mind that whether it's the Trailblazer or the Envoy, the starter, crankshaft position sensor, purge valve, and both of your knock sensors are located on the driver's side of the motor, okay? To access that stuff, all you need to do is jack the driver's side of the vehicle up, remove the driver's wheel, and you'll be able to look in and see that stuff. I have a video out there that shows you where the purge valve is located on a Envoy as well, okay? So just for those of you who are looking for that stuff. Again, throttle body, ignition coils, okay? Remember, purge valve, crank sensor, knock sensor, starter, all that stuff is on the driver's side of the motor. Okay folks, now we're at the 2006 Chevy Trailblazer, and basically again it's the same motor, alternator, bracket as the Envoy. Again, remember I told you how to determine if the temp sensor is behind the alternator. Notice you don't see any electrical connector here. Remove the air box, the runway, go all the way in the back of the runway, and what you will find right there is the coolant temp sensor's electrical connector. Pry it out of its housing, and the coolant temp sensor is located just beneath this pipe right here. And typically that silver stuff would cover all of this. And remember, you can push this pipe forward to expose the sensor if you need to. To get the electrical connector loose, it's the same as on the 04, okay? It's a tab just like this. Pry the sensor's connector out of its housing, just like before, and then go down there and cut that wire as close to the sensor as you possibly can. Again, take a pry tool, pry that electrical connector out of its housing. Remember to put the new one back into the hole. Make sure it's secure and plugged in. Cut the wire at the sensor, and all I do is go on this side and reach up in there with a pair of cutters, and I cut the wire from there. You'll always have these little flaps, guys. Just pin the flap up or remove it. Look up in there in the corner and you will see the coolant temperature sensor sitting right there. It's the sensor just to the left of that top rusty bolt. So that's your coolant temp sensor right there. Remember, the sensor located behind the alternator, whether it's an Envoy or a Trailblazer, it's an 18mm socket that you need to remove that sensor, and an 18mm wrench or crow's foot to tighten it. On the Envoy or Trailblazer that has the coolant temp sensor located on the passenger side of the motor next to the firewall, which is what you're looking at, it's a 15mm socket. So you can try a 15mm crow's foot or 16, 17, or 18mm crow's foot to see what will work to help you tighten it. And I just take a 15mm socket after I cut that wire, take a couple of long drivers, I place the socket over the sensor, lefty loosey, righty tighty to get it out, guys. I wanted to point out something. In most cases, when you look up in there, guys, this line will be in your way. Again, from the top, you can push it out of your way so that you can expose the sensor. Just remember that. You may not always see it when you first look up there. Take your cutters, just reach up in there and cut the wire. So there's what I do, guys. 15mm socket, a swivel, and a couple of long drivers. Lefty loosey, righty tighty. Have a pair of needle nose pliers on hand, guys. My experience has been sometimes when you put the sensor in or remove it, the socket will stay, or it has the tendency to want to stay stuck around the sensor. So you may need to take a pair of needle nose pliers and go in there and pull the socket out. Again, lefty loosey, righty tighty. And now you just turn it until the sensor comes out. Okay, try my best to show you that. And there is your old coolant temperature sensor. How do I get it back in, guys? I simply reach back up in there. Okay. Where's my hole? Such a tight spot. I just reach back up in there with my hand, screw it in as tight as I possibly can get it by hand, and then you're just gonna have to take your 15mm crow's foot or whatever size crow's foot fits over the coolant temp sensor and turn it in. You only need to turn it a couple of good times, okay? It shouldn't take a great deal of force to break this loose, and you don't need a great deal of force to tighten it, okay? So I wanted you folks to see that I put the old sensor back in, but the socket stayed stuck in there. So I'll just take some needle nose pliers and go up in there and get it, okay? This part could be a pain in the ass sometimes, guys. Well, maybe I can grab it this time. Okay, this time I can grab it. All right. So there's the sensor back in, okay? Just take your time. And guys, again, when you put it in, hand tighten it. You want to take, before you put that new sensor in, get yourself some crow's feet. Find out which one fits over your sensor. This is a crow's foot. For those of you who are not used to them, if you don't have any of the tools that I mentioned in today's video, that means a trip to the auto parts store for you to get tools, okay? And then you just have to put your crow's foot up in that corner and go to work as best you can to tighten it. This is a tedious process up in there, guys, okay? But you'll have to take your time and you'll get it, but make sure that it's tight, okay? All right, folks, I know this has been a lengthy video, but remember, The Trailblazer 4.2 liter motor is the same as the Envoy 4.2 liter motor. Again, if you need to replace the alternator because it failed, or if you need to remove the alternator to get to the coolant temp sensor, I have a video out there that shows you how to do that. Watch that video, or one of the many other videos out there that will show you how to take all this stuff apart. And again, now you know, no sensor there means the coolant temperature sensor is on the passenger side of the motor. Oil cap, remove the air box, runway, and if you do not see that bolt hole there with the sensor's electrical connector going down into it, and then the wiring harness running to the left, then your sensor is not there, okay? All right, folks, I hope this video has been helpful. And remember to remove the sensor that is located on the back side of the engine against the firewall, whether it's Trailblazer or Envoy. You can easily do it from the front passenger side, okay, just like I showed you. Jack the front passenger side up. Here's your strut. Come to your left, wheel well. You'll see that little flap, remove it, and then your sensor is back up in there in that corner. Okay, guys, I hope the video has been helpful. Thanks for watching.